topic is so important, is that in Ramadan, our hearts, our minds, they become focused on our ruh and the ghayb. Right? We become focused on the unseen. We become focused on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the angels, our deeds, Laylatul Qadr. We start making du'as and trying to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We think and talk about Jannah and Jahannam. Yet we live in a world that tells us that seeing is believing. And hence the title, seeing is not believing. We hear the phrases like, if you can't measure it, you can't see it, it doesn't exist. So now in a month where we're engaging with the most profound metaphysical realities, it's only fitting, and it only makes sense to have a conversation about how our faith differs in a scientific paradigm that rejects the metaphysical. And that's the topic that we're diving into today. This topic that raises both intellectual and spiritual questions, specifically the topic of evolution, the scientific method, and how Islam approaches science, what relationship it has with it. Unfortunately, for many people, science feels like the final authority. It's viewed as being completely objective, infallible, and continuously progressing. But tonight we're going to ask some deeper questions, like, does the Western scientific paradigm truly seek truth? Or is it more concerned with controlling and manipulating the world? How do Muslims balance empirical observation with the timeless truths of revelation? Things like that, inshallah. Islam has a very rich legacy of scientific inquiry. We're champions of knowledge, not enemies of knowledge. But we're here to challenge some ideas that we hold to be true today, inshallah. And that's why we're very, very honored to have our beloved, respected guest, Maulana Tahseen Khan. Maulana Tahseen was born and raised in the Philadelphia region, and he completed the Dars al-Nizami mainly through private in-person studies under various authorized, respected scholars, mashallah. And he currently lives and resides in the Chicagoland suburbs, and he teaches Kalam, which is dialectic theology at Dar es Salaam. And by profession, he is a chemical engineer, mashallah. Maulana Sahib is also a published author. He has 3 published works: The Providence of Man, a Sunni apologetic on the original creation of Adam, God's attributes that relate to the world, and divine unity. So inshallah at the end we'll kind of get into a little bit of his works as well, inshallah, if we have some time. So Maulana Sahib, for being here today. We're very, very happy to have you. So we'll inshallah dive right into the juicy stuff, right? There's a lot of juicy stuff, so I don't want to waste more time, inshallah. So the first question that also that we're going to explore is, before I get to that, you guys can also ask questions on the Slido. You can scan that and ask any questions anytime. I have them coming up on my screen. However, please only ask questions that are related to this topic, right? Like music, ancillary angles. This is not the forum for that, inshallah we'll have a different program, right? So whatever Maulana was talking about, if you have questions related to that, you can ask that. So now, going back to our question, the first thing that I want to explore, Maulana, is what is the relationship between Islam and science? How does science fit into our worldview?
Everybody here? Yeah. Yes. First, I want to begin by saying, Jazakallah khairan to Siddiq for giving me the opportunity to come here. It's my first time to this masjid, and I'm very amazed at the beauty of this masjid and the community that even after 11:35, we still have a large number of people here. MashaAllah, it's something very pleasing to the eye. So, what is the relationship between Islam and science? Perhaps we can begin by saying that there is a famous quote by one of our great scholars, Imam al-Nasafi, rahimahullah, who said that أسباب العلم للخلق ثلاثة الحواس السليمة والخبر الصادق والعقل. He said that the number of ways to true knowledge are 3: the sound senses, the testimony, and through rational reasoning. So that we can focus more on the first one, al-hawas al-salima, sound senses. What does this refer to? This refers to essentially empirical methods, or the scientific method in particular, that we know things by way of observation. We can derive knowledge by way of our five senses. We can derive knowledge by the scientific method. And so immediately we see that within our epistemology, within our theory of knowledge, this is something ingrained, that we observe and we derive true knowledge. And furthermore, Mufti Sadiq himself is probably very well aware, I'm sure he is, that in the curriculum that is studied for Islamic studies or for Alimiyya, we all study a subject on logic. And these manuals of logic date back maybe 1,000 years ago or more. In every one of these manuals of logic, they have a section called Aqsam al-Yaqiniyya, or the section on how you can derive knowledge that is certain, that is true, that has certainty with it. And amongst these ways, they always list what is known as mushahadat, or things that can be observed, or mahsusat, things that you can sense through the five senses, or mujarrabat, which is essentially the modern term, or the modern term for empirical methods or scientific reasoning, scientific method. So immediately, what you can understand from this is that deeply ingrained within our curriculum, there has always been an appreciation of the scientific method, of science in general. And this is something that is deeply rooted, and I'm sure many of you have heard about our history, about how many Muslim scientists there were, their vast number of inventions, the advancements that they made in all fields of medicine and anatomy and chemistry and ophthalmology and physics and chemistry and mathematics. All this is a result of knowing and understanding that the scientific method is a means of deriving true knowledge. So that would be, in a nutshell, establishing that there is a relationship between Islam and science.
No, every science, every endeavor that we have has an objective, right? So the Western approach to science and the Islamic approach to science, do they have similar goals, different goals, or is the difference only like slight differences in methodology?
So that's a good question. If we can refer back to whom they refer to as the father of the scientific method, Francis Bacon. So he said that he defined science as that endeavor where you predict and manipulate nature for the benefit of mankind. That's essentially how he defined science. The prediction and the manipulation of nature in order to benefit humans. Now, the first question that may appear is that something that we would be against? No. If we have the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that said, خَيْرُ النَّاسِ أَنْفَعُهُمْ لِلنَّاسِ, that the best of people are those that give the most benefit to the people. So if Francis Bacon is saying that we want to use science for the benefit of mankind, then from a purely Islamic perspective, that would be praiseworthy. So long as the endeavor is something truly beneficial to mankind, we would not have an issue with that. Now, the issue that does occur is that scientists, in the world that we live in today, restrict science as being the only means of deriving true knowledge. That's where we would differ with them. Moreover, we would see science as a tool to see the precision of the maker of the universe. So we wouldn't use science just merely for the sake of discovering natural law, and then using that natural law to see how we can benefit mankind. That would be one aspect of it. But another aspect would be
what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to in the Quran, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ. That we will show them our signs in the horizons and within their own selves until the truth becomes clear to them. So our endeavor of science differs from the Western paradigm that we're not just looking to benefit ourselves or to benefit humans, but we also want to see the precision in the order in which the maker of the universe has placed this universe, and then to appreciate the maker in return, and to know that he is the truth. لَهُ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ. That this is the truth, that there is a maker behind all these natural laws. And so we shouldn't be just short-sighted, and when we find something or discover something in the natural law, we shouldn't just take it in a shallow manner and to use it for our benefit. But rather, it's very important that on top of using it for our benefit, we acknowledge the one who placed that order within the universe, to appreciate the maker, to believe in the maker. So this is where we would differ. So as you can see, there is some overlap in the way that we would conduct ourselves within the field of science, but there's also a difference there too.
So this difference that we're talking about, what impact does it have in the real world? Why is this difference so important?
So traditionally, it wasn't always the way that it is today. From the 17th century and onwards, due to the scientific revolution, many non-Muslim scientists began to see scientific method as the exclusive method by which true knowledge should be derived from. Whereas prior to the 17th century, non-Muslim scientists, many of them were believers in God. Individuals like Descartes, Kepler, Newton, they believed in the existence of a creator God. And so they acknowledged that one could obtain true knowledge, not just from the empirical methods of science, but also through revelation, also through rational reason. But from the 17th century onwards, the tide started to shift, where many scientists in the Western world began to see science as the only way, the only method of arriving at true knowledge. And so there was a shift, and that shift continued, and I would say that that shift became even more pronounced post 9/11, when the neo-atheist movement began, and they, in a sense, kind of made this method of using science as the only way to arrive at knowledge in a very militant manner. And not only that, many non-Muslim academics today have acknowledged that the neo-atheist movement has in mind Islam as their greatest target. This was said by non-Muslim academics, that not only are they against theism in general, anybody who believes in God, but the neo-atheist movement is in particular sees Islam as their greatest enemy, as their greatest threat. So this is important for us to keep in mind, and the relevance for today comes because of that. If you know that somebody is trying to target you in what you believe in, then it behooves you to make sure that you're armed and ready for the onslaught that they're using to target you. A few years ago there was a survey done about how many Muslims who were born and raised in America leave Islam by the time they reach adulthood. Anybody want to venture a guess as to what that percent is? How many Muslims who were born and raised in America, by the time they reach adulthood, they no longer identify as a Muslim? It's around 25%. And this study was done 2 years back to back. And one time I think it was 24%, the other time it was like 23%. And this was some years back, and they said that the trend was that it was increasing. So you can only imagine, and if you know anything about polls, people are less likely to admit something even if they truly adhere to it. So although it was 25%, most likely it's probably closer to 30%, if not more. So that's truly alarming. I mean, you can imagine that, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 3, that's a that should make every single community within America want to ensure that their community's generation, their younger generation, do not fall into that statistic. And so we see the relevance of making sure that we understand the tactics that they're using against us, and so that we can inform and teach our communities so that they can not fall into the traps of that movement.
So is there a reason why the neo-atheist movement specifically targeting Islam?
I think it's because they see Islam as, I mean, in their eyes, they would see Muslims as being very dogmatic about their beliefs. These people, obviously there are many theists out there, Christians, Jews, who also believe in God, but they see Islam as a threat more so because they find their adherents to be more devoted and more disciplined, which they would call blind belief, blind fanaticism. But obviously we would differ with them on that. But I think it's because of the adherence that we have versus relative to other people who may just be, a believer in God just in terms of, celebrating occasions and holidays, but not necessarily adopting it in their personal lives as a worldview, as much as Muslims do.
So now we've been talking about science in general, kind of tuning into the specific topic for today. How and why did the issue of evolution become such a major theological issue for Muslims? And what are the core conflicts between Western science and Islamic belief?
Yeah, it's a great question. And when I was writing my book, this is one of the things that I investigated as well, as to why did evolution become so widespread in the Muslim world, or how did that happen? In the sense that that even a common person will know about evolution and the tension between evolution and the being. So if you are familiar with Charles Darwin when he published his book, The Origin of Species, so Charles Darwin died in 1881, if I'm not mistaken. 1881, the year of his death, was the same year in which his book, The Origin of Species, was translated into Arabic by a Lebanese physician who was a scientific materialist, and then it spread from there. And then you have individuals who had a lot of political influence, like Muhammad Abduh in Egypt, as well as Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, who really put this into the school curriculum, and it spread from there throughout the entire Muslim world. But what occurred on a social level was that it reached an extent where people started seeing that if you believed in evolution, then it was a sign of you being an educated man, a modern man. Whereas on the flip side, if you didn't believe in education, but you believed in, let's say, what the traditional narrative is within Islam, or whether it be in Christianity, then you were seen as just a blind, dogmatic believer. Somebody who was seen as like, uneducated, he's not a man of science, he's not a modern man, he's not an aristocrat, he's not from the elite, but rather he's from the common folk who don't know anything about the world that we live in. I recall that Noam Chomsky, the great intellectual in the contemporary age, Noam Chomsky once remarked that he said that he found his interactions with professors from the Muslim world to be very remarkable in that he said that he found them to be more militant in their belief in scientific materialism and atheism than professors of the West. So you can only imagine that if Noam Chomsky himself, who himself is an atheist, is saying about Muslim maybe not Muslim professors, but professors from the Muslim world, to be more militant in their belief in science over scripture, over Quran and Sunnah, or over religion in general, than those in the West. So it gives you an idea of how far this belief in science reached in the Muslim world. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
The second part was that what are the core conflicts between this idea of the Western concept of evolution versus Islamic beliefs?
Yeah, so evolution has many different moving parts to it, and many different types to it, but one thing that they all share in common is the belief in random mutation and natural selection. Those are kind of like the engines that drive evolution, whether it be micro or macro, Darwinian evolution, neo-Darwinian evolution. So natural selection is essentially survival of the fittest. The idea that there are certain traits that are going to be passed on to the next generation that are more advantageous due to environmental factors. And then random mutation would be the idea that there's a natural change that occurs within your DNA. So, from an Islamic perspective, why is that an issue? Well, it really wouldn't be an issue unless you believe that natural selection and random mutation occur independent of the will of God, independent of the iradatullah. If you believe that these things are functioning and occurring on their own, without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willing them into being, then it would be a theological issue. But if you believe in them in the sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is permitting things to function in this way, then it wouldn't be an issue. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second issue is the one that is more known, which is the common descent issue. The idea that human species and other species, whether it be primates or other species from within the animal kingdom, all have a common ancestor. Now, obviously, that would be problematic from the Islamic perspective because we generally hold the belief that Banu Adam, or the children of Adam alayhi salam, all go be turned back to Adam alayhi salam, and he was an original creation, meaning Adam alayhi salam did not descend from previous ancestors. In other words, he didn't have parents himself. He was the first and original creation from which all of mankind then descended. That issue is probably the most prominent issue between evolution and the deen. The idea that did Adam alayhi salam descend from ancestors, or was he an original creation?
You talked about how there's different types of beliefs in evolution, different theories of evolution. Can you give us some examples of what those are?
Yeah, so for example, if we look at microevolution and macroevolution, microevolution would be that you're seeing changes within a species. Obviously, there's nothing that is observable. Darwin himself noted that in his book about the finches, the birds, their beaks and whatnot. And this is something that we observe in society, that people adapt and changes occur throughout time as a result of that. So this is widely accepted, even with, there's no reason for any Muslim to deny microevolution. Macroevolution, on the other hand, is that you have a certain species that then changes into a new species. Now that's something that hasn't been observed. And so, from a theological perspective, it would not be an issue if someone believed that regarding all other species minus Banu Adam. So a person can believe that, let's say that birds are originally, they descended from prehistoric dinosaurs, flying dinosaurs. That's okay for somebody to believe it. But they cannot believe the same thing about the human species. And we'll get into that and the reasoning behind that. But essentially, yeah, that would be an example of both microevolution and macroevolution.
I think it's a good segue, right? So we talked about how Islam and the Muslims, we believe in these senses being a source of true information. But you talked about kind of touched on how we also believe that there's other sources of receiving true information. Whereas we're talking about modern science restricts information to only the empirical senses. So in our epistemology, where does wahi fit in?
So wahi would fit into what we call the khabar al-sadiq, or testimony, the knowledge that has been conveyed by by way of testimony. So, obviously, in a scientific, philosophical, naturalist worldview, there is no acknowledgement of a divine creator. So if you have no divine creator in your worldview, then obviously you're not going to honor divine revelation. So that's essentially where the issue arises from. Whereas in our worldview, in our epistemology, in our theory of knowledge, because we acknowledge a creator, we then acknowledge that this creator can inform you about certain things that you would not know unless he informed you. And so this is obviously by way of a prophet, a true prophet, and then revealing to this true prophet revelation by which we can then derive knowledge through that.
There's a question from the crowd which I think might be a good thing to ask. He said that it was about the previous question, doesn't microevolution necessitate macroevolution if taxonomy is arbitrary?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and a lot of scientists do believe that, where they say that, okay, so if you're going to acknowledge microevolution, then you should also acknowledge macroevolution. However, I wouldn't say that everybody, even within the scientific community, that's something that's a matter of consensus. It's not. There are many scientists out there who themselves are atheists who would argue that no, just because you acknowledge microevolution, changes within a species, that doesn't necessarily then necessitate that there should be macroevolution or a change from one species to another.
Going back, we were talking about wahi being a categorical solid. What do we do now when we have these different sources of receiving information that we believe are both valid, but then one clashes with the other? Like, for example, in the situation of Adonai scenario, wahi is telling us one thing and data is telling us something else.
Yeah, so that's a great question. That I mentioned that we have three ways of arriving at true knowledge. So what happens when there seems to be an apparent contradiction? And I say apparent, and you'll understand why I'm saying apparent. So at that point, if there seems to be an apparent contradiction, then what needs to be done is there needs to be a weighing of evidences. Because it may be the case that what the Quran is saying could be interpreted in a different way. For example, so a lot of people give this example where they say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, وَإِذَا الْأَرْضِ كَيْفَ سُطِحَتْ, that the earth, they use that to say that, look, maybe the earth is flat, because he's saying سُطِحَتْ, which means like to spread out. And even when we are, walking down the street, we don't see the earth being spherical. We see it as being flat. And so, using this ayah and other ayat like it, they say that the earth, could this, if we were to take this literally, doesn't it mean that the Quran is telling us that the earth is flat? However, as far back as maybe 1,000 years ago, during the time of Ibn Hazm, he mentioned that that there is a consensus regarding the earth being spherical, being circular. And he mentions further that the way we know that is through empirical methods. That this has been calculated through using our knowledge of astronomy during that day, during that time, and that there is a consensus. And then Imam Fakhruddin Arazi in his tafsir reiterates this, saying that there is a consensus amongst Muslim scholars that the earth is in fact circular, it's spherical, it's not flat. So then what do we do with the ayah, right? So then we take it to mean, not that the earth is flat, because we know through science that this is an absolutely indisputable fact that the earth is spherical. So we'll say that what that means is, from the eyes of the observer, what the earth appears to be. Like I said, when you're walking down the street, what do you see? You see the earth being outstretched and flat. So the ayah is talking from the observer's point of view, not from a scientific reality point of view, or from an astronomical point of view, but from the observer's point of view, meaning our view when we walk down the street. So this is an example of information that we derive from science that the earth is spherical, but we have an ayah that seems to say that no, it's stretched out, but then we use this scientific knowledge and we weigh the evidence of it. And we realize that this science, that this scientific belief is actually a scientific fact. It's indisputable. So then we have no choice but to understand the ayah in a way that is consistent with the language, as well as consistent with the context. And so then we can easily say that no, the ayah is simply saying that we understand that from the observer's perspective, the earth seems to be flat, as when you're walking down the street. Now, when it comes to evolution, some people want to argue the same thing, saying that, oh no, look, we have indisputable scientific evidence that evolution has taken place, and therefore, whatever ayat are mentioned in the Quran have to be reinterpreted. But I argue in my book that no, when it comes to this specific issue, it's not the case. That what science is saying is not 100% decisive for Adam and Islam, for the species of Banu Adam. And on top of that, we have an ayah in the Quran that cannot be interpreted in a way that we would affirm then parents for Adam and Islam. We can get into more of that. But one important thing I forgot to mention is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. That do they not reflect upon this Quran, that had it been from anyone other than Allah, then they would have found in this Quran many inconsistencies. So the ulama used this verse and said it could never be the case. It's a really important principle. It can never be the case that the Quran is saying something in definitive terms, and science is saying something in definitive terms, and the two contradict one another. It can never be the case because of this ayah. So whenever you have a situation where you're seeing that you have a clash between two sources of knowledge, you must know immediately that one of the two is not saying, at least on the outward, what it appears to be saying. That there must be, that one must, if in fact there is a true contradiction that is irreconcilable. That there must be one that is of stronger evidence than the other. So that's important. That ayah is a very important ayah when you're analyzing a clash or apparent contradiction between different sources of knowledge.
Would we like to get into that ayah now?
Sure. Regarding Adam and Islam. So, what we can say is, one of the things that I realized when I was writing my book on evolution is that many Muslims who do affirm evolution and say that the Quran has to be reinterpreted, they're actually not, it's not that they have a lot of knowledge of the science and that they've been convinced of the science. It actually has nothing to do with that. In my conversations with many of them, I realized that they only believe in evolution because they don't want to believe in something that is supernatural or miraculous. So they don't want to believe that there was a man, a human man, who didn't have parents. So because they don't allow anything supernatural or miraculous to occur in their worldview, then they don't want to allow any miracle, whether it be the miracles of the prophets, or the creation of a man without any parents. They feel a lot more comfortable in accepting a theory that says, no, every human must have parents, and therefore they adopt this view. Many of them are completely ignorant of the science, of evolutionary science. They have no background, but yet they're die-hard evolutionary theorists because they just don't accept miracles in their worldview. So what's important is to understand is, how do we rationalize miracles in our worldview as Muslims? Something very important, right? Because if you do not acknowledge the supernatural, and like Mufti Siddiq mentioned that seeing is not believing, according to or seeing is believing, rather, according to what we hear today in society. And so this belief in the unseen is something really central to our deen. And so if we are not ready to believe in the supernatural, then our entire deen will come collapsing down. Because immediately one could question that, how did a man receive revelation from a quote-unquote angel that we cannot even observe? So right away, that's something supernatural. And so if you're against supernatural events or miracles, then immediately you're going to struggle with something as simple and fundamental in our deen as divine revelation, or a prophet, or the Quran itself. Without even looking into the message of the Quran, you've already had a problem with it. So it's important that we understand, how do we rationalize supernatural events or miracles? So the way that we rationalize anything supernatural or miraculous is by way of understanding that once we acknowledge that there is a creator, then what we understand from there is that this creator must be omnipotent. He must be all-powerful. What we mean by that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَاللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. So we attribute this creator God with absolute omnipotence, absolute power. Now in this ayah, وَاللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ, there's a lot of discussion on what is meant by kulli shay. What is shay? So we usually translate shay as thing. But if we wanted to dig deeper, what falls under thing? And so the ulama explained that thing here means all that is rationally possible. What does that mean? All that is rationally possible. So if I said to you, can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create the sky to be pink with green polka dots with purple stripes in between? Is that something rationally possible? Or is that rationally impossible? Can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make the sky, instead of it being beautiful sky blue on a cloudless sunny day, instead of that, can He make it to be pink with green polka dots and maroon stripes? Yes, it's rationally possible. What if I said to you that, please sit and stand at the same time? Can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that rationally possible for Him?
No possible.
That if we said, if I said that to you, for example, can you please stand and sit at the same time? Is that rationally possible? So why isn't that rationally possible?
One cancel the other.
Exactly. So when I say to you, can you please stand and sit at the same time, what I'm asking you to do is I'm conjointly asking you to do something and not do it at the same time. If you understand what the word stand means, which is the opposite of sit, if you understand what sit means, which is the opposite of stand, then the two cannot conjointly exist at the same time in the same way. So this is an example of something that is rationally impossible. Why? Because it violates the law of non-contradiction. Another thing could be like if I said that I don't own, this is just an example, I don't own a pet dog, but I own a golden retriever. Is that possible? Why isn't that possible? Because I affirm the greater species, but then, or I denied it, but then I affirm a particular within that. So this is obviously something impossible. So the idea is that anything that violates the law of non-contradiction will be rationally impossible. So when we talk about Allahu ala kulli shay'in qadir, then shay in this ayah means anything rationally possible. So like sometimes philosophers ask, can your God create a square circle? So would that be a shape in the ayah? Would that fall under shape? The creation of a square circle. No, because it's something rationally impossible. Why? Because if you know by definition, a circle doesn't have sides, where by definition a square has sides, then there can never be a square circle. This has nothing to do with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power. This is an absurdity. It's an absurd request. The request itself doesn't have meaning to it. And so therefore it's not going to fall under the ayah Wallahu ala kulli shay'in qadir. So long as that which does not violate the law of non-contradiction, then that thing will fall under the understanding of the word shay in this ayah, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power will be applicable to it. So all these things like creating the sky to be pink polka dots with blue stripe, all that is possible for Allah. So now, if I ask you along the same lines, can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create a man without any parents?
Yes.
Now, if we use this ayah, does that fall under shay or does it not?
On the side.
It does. Because there's nothing rationally illogical or a violation of the law of non-contradiction when you think about a human being created without two parents. Yes, is it something against the norm? Of course. Have we ever met somebody who doesn't have parents? No. Will we ever meet somebody? No. Perhaps not until we meet Adam and Isa. But the fact of the matter is that this is something that is rationally possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power applies to everything that is rationally possible, the mere possibility of a man being created without any parents is something that, from our theological standpoint, is not an issue. The only thing left to determine is, but did it really happen or not? We can rationalize that such a supernatural event is possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, based on what we just discussed. But then the secondary question to that, the follow-up question would be, but did it happen? Just because something is rationally possible doesn't mean that it occurred. You now have to bring forth proof to show that it actually occurred. And that, the only way you're going to know that is by way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informing you. And so now obviously, again, what we said is, do we have an apparent contradiction here between our evidence, our sources of knowledge? It certainly seems like we do. Because on one hand, all of us can attest that we've never met a human who didn't have parents. And so scientifically speaking, if we factor in all the lines of scientific evidence found in evolution and found in just observation and everything, and we combine all that evidence together, then what that tells us is that it is absolutely certain that every human must have parents. But then at the same time, we have ayat in the Quran, like the most, in my view, the position that I take is that the ayah, إِنَّ مَثَلَ عِيسَى عِنْدَ اللَّهِ كَمَثَلِ آدَمَ خَلَقَهُ مِنْ تُرَابٍ ثُمَّ قَالَ لَهُ كُنْ فَيَكُونُ is the most definitive ayah for proving that Adam alayhi salam did not have parents. Now, and I go into great lengths to show that, but we have a contradiction here. If we take this ayah to mean that Adam alayhi salam did not have any parents, and at the same time, like I said, we're having science tells us that, and our own observation tells us, that every single human has had parents, then how do we reconcile it? The way that we would reconcile it here is that when it comes to, we would view Adam alayhi salam as being the anomaly to the rule. That in general, yes, it's true that every single human must have parents. But like I said, if you in your worldview accept a divine creator who has the ability to effect miracles, then it shouldn't be so much of a stretch for you to believe that he created one individual, the very first one, Adam alayhi salam himself, without parents, but then designated that every single individual thereafter will have parents. And so we reconcile it in that way. I know that was a very long answer, very involved, but if anybody has further questions on any of the points that I made, feel free to ask through.
Yeah, there's some good questions that can
Okay.
inshallah, we'll get to inshallah. But before we get to those, let's just finish inshallah the principles of this discussion and we can get into the particulars inshallah. So, obviously, I think that was a very good explanation of like how we rationalize and deal with wahi versus mushahada and empirical evidence. To conclude this discussion from the angle of our principles, how do we then preserve our iman and maintain our belief in wahi in this age that's dominated by scientism and is dominated by this Western scientific narrative that only accepts empirical data and has no room for supernatural, metaphysical, and has no room for wahi, and in this world that's so rapid and evolving?
Yeah, it's an important question, and like I said, so I know many people are probably familiar with most of Imam's Yaqeen Institute. Yaqeen Institute did a study maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, in which they tried to determine what they call the drivers of doubt. What makes Muslims doubt their religion, doubt the truth of their religion? And so they surveyed around 600 Muslims throughout America. And they found that when it comes particularly to evolution, they found that 76% of people find evolution to be a driver of doubt for them personally. And that's very high if you think about it. And so it's important for us to understand that why do we have these drivers of doubt where people question their theology? Now the only way, like I said, in our epistemology, in our theory of knowledge, the sources of knowledge are rational reasoning, testimony, meaning like divine revelation, and the 5 senses, observation, scientific methods, and hawas study. Now what's important to understand is that you're only going to fall into doubting your religion if you don't have firm belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you have to arrive at believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rationally so that you have firm belief in the revelation that He has given you. This is something very important. So if people are asking in this advanced scientific, technological world that we find ourselves living in today, that things are progressing so rapidly that it's actually very hard to keep up with technology. And it's only going to get worse depending on which perspective you're looking at it. Because even the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that for every subsequent generation, the fitnas will only grow. And each subsequent generation will be worse than the previous one. And so, I know it's a very pessimistic way of looking at it, but things are only going to get worse. And this is, we know this by virtue of analyzing all the narrations about the end of times. So what to do as an individual? What should you be doing? The best thing you can do for yourself is to educate yourself. By taking classes with your local imams, with your local shuyukh, so that you don't fall into those traps where now you're in a position where you're in doubt, you don't understand how to understand this particular scientific theory or this advancement in technology. You see it as undermining the roots of your religion. There is nothing better for you to do than to educate yourself. This is the most important thing you can do. Specifically in the fundamentals of belief. Why do you believe in God? You have to start from there. Because our entire theological narrative rests on belief in God. So if your foundation itself is weak, where you simply believe in God because you feel like I just grew up in a family who said that they believe in God, then you're going to be more susceptible to these drivers of doubt. And so, if you are in that position, it's important that you educate yourself so that you don't for every time there's a new wave of fitna that comes, your worldview does not get shook up. Rather, you have the ability to stand firmly on your 2 feet and understand and rationalize what's going on. And the second way of ensuring that you don't fall into these traps or into a position of skepticism or doubt in your religion is by making dua. We have numerous du'as within the Sunnah where the Prophet ﷺ himself and verses in the Quran where we make dua to protect ourselves and our iman on a theological level. Verses like ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. And then like famous du'as like اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم حبب إلينا الإيمان وزينه في قلوبنا وكره إلينا الكفر والفسوق والعصيان. اللهم ثبت أقدامنا على دينك. All of these du'as are found within the Sunnah, therefore protecting our iman. So, on a practical level, you should learn your deen, the fundamentals of your deen, and then on a spiritual level, you should continually make these du'as for protection and faithfulness.
I'll ask 2 more questions from my side. As Muslims, then, we have our own worldview, we have our own outlook on how we see and understand the world around us. How should a Muslim then operate in this Western paradigm, this Western world, and what is the Muslim's role when he's engaging in science?
Yeah, some people actually, I've heard, Muslim modern scientists mention that, if you don't believe in evolution, then you can never be a Muslim scientist, because the two are at odds with one another. But I disagree with this very much, because, like I said, historically, most scientists were believers in God. It was only since the scientific revolution that scientists became disbelievers in God. So the idea that a Muslim cannot function as a scientist in the modern world is a very naive way of looking at things. Like I said, in our worldview, science has a place. So we should make a distinction between the scientific method and science itself and scientism as a belief. Well, what's the difference? Scientism would be the belief that you only view science as the only way of arriving at truth. So if you want to become a believer in scientism, then obviously that's going to conflict with your deen. But if you want to maintain your deen and be a firm Muslim, but also practice science, then there's no conflict there. It's only when you adopt the scientism worldview is when you're going to run into an issue. But there's no conflict in practicing the scientific method, as has been done by so many Muslim scientists in the past, and still maintaining their deen. Because they use science to discover the order and itqan, the precision by their creators. And so when they did science, their iman only grew because of what they discovered about the natural law, about the natural world. So if you practice science today with that intention, then you have nothing but to gain. So this is the outlook that a Muslim scientist should have in today's world.
Yes, I remember one of my teachers pointed out as well that the ayah in the Manshullah, the context that comes in like geology, biology, let's make this tawfiq to strengthen our iman by all my endeavors that we do. Now finally, can you tell us a little bit about your book, what's it about and how can you benefit?
Yeah, so the book is very academic in nature. It's not a very easy read. You have to be focused when reading it. But essentially, what we discussed today is what I discussed in the book on a more detailed level. Namely, I begin by trying to rationalize why and how can we believe in the supernatural. And that will essentially lead us to then conclude that the possibility of a man being created without parents is possible, it's rationally possible. And then from there I go on to then prove that this in fact did occur by looking at certain verses in the Quran and showing that they must be interpreted this way and they cannot be interpreted in any other way. So that's essentially the approach that I took in the book.
And where can we find your book with you guys?
Yeah, the book can be purchased on Dar es Salaam in their library, not library, their bookstore sells it locally here. But alternatively, you can, there's a bookstore, online bookstore called Mecca Books. Many people I'm sure are familiar with it. If you go to Mecca Books, they also sell it on their website too.
The book, by the way, again, is called The Providence of Man, the Sunni Apologetic and the Version of Creation of God. Now, opening up the floor to some of the audience questions, inshallah. Somewhat short one. What is the Islamic perspective about the existence of dinosaurs?
Yeah, there's no harm in believing in dinosaurs. If somebody wants to believe in them, that's fine. If somebody doesn't want to believe in them, that's also fine. You're not theologically bound to believe or disbelieve in the dinosaurs.
Does the Big Bang Theory contradict Islam?
No, the Big Bang Theory does not contradict Islam. It would only contradict Islam if you believe that the Big Bang Theory happened on one second. We would say that there is a metaphysical cause behind the Big Bang Theory, i.e. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if you believe in the Big Bang and you believe that, oh, it just popped into existence on its own, then obviously that would be problematic. And even Stephen Hawking, shortly before he died, people asked him that, what about the Big Bang? Does it, did it really just happen on its own? Or, is there a possibility that something caused it? And he said that the question is a pointless question. He said that because we can't materially measure that caused the Big Bang, therefore there's no point in even entertaining that question. But obviously from our view, we would see that as being something very naive, very unsophisticated, because just because something cannot be measured doesn't mean it doesn't have that a metaphysical cause cannot be behind it.
So this is how can students approach their science studies with an Islamic perspective, through an Islamic lens, whereas their whole lives they've been taught to think from the Western paradigm?
Yeah, so it's going to take some unwinding to do, some rewiring to do, because you have to, especially if you've gone through the public schooling system like I have, and not through an Islamic school. Even through an Islamic school, it depends which Islamic school you went to. But you do have to kind of reframe your thinking. And the way you're going to do that is by understanding what is your epistemology. Again, epistemology is just a fancy word for your theory of knowledge. What is your theory of knowledge as a Muslim? Like we mentioned, your theory of knowledge is that true knowledge can be derived through empirical methods, through science, through rational reasoning, as well as through testimony. And divine revelation, wahi, Quran, Sunnah will fall under testimony. So the more you study epistemology, Islamic epistemology, the sources of true knowledge in our deen, the more you'll be better suited to engage in science, essentially. So that would be my advice to go and learn what your Islamic epistemology is so that you can understand what the sources of true knowledge are.
So based off of that response, I'll add something to the previous question. Someone who hasn't studied epistemology, then how can they debate against someone who strictly believes in evolution and science? Or even should they?
It'll be very difficult unless you somehow can prove to them. Then the only option you have then is to argue them on the grounds of science. And you have many, scientists, non-Muslim scientists out there who reject evolution on grounds of science, where they say no, the science behind evolution is inconsistent. It's not what it's been, what everybody says about it, and there's a lot of inaccuracies. So that would be your only option. Because if you don't have in your worldview the other sources of knowledge, then you have no way of arguing against evolution unless you do it on their ground.
This is a more specific question. Are there any examples whatsoever of beneficial mutations aside from sickle cell? If not, then why is macroevolution being pushed as a fact?
I'm not an evolutionary scientist by training, so I don't know if I can sufficiently answer the first question. But the second question, why is it being rejected? You can read about that, like I said earlier on, that it's not, there's many scientists who say that belief in microevolution does not necessitate macroevolution. And there's a lot of literature out there, so I would just urge you to investigate further on your own to see why it would not necessitate that.
Did historical persecution from theists influence the militant nature of modern Western science?
Can you repeat it one more time?
So, did historical persecution from the theists influence the militant nature of modern Western science?
Yeah, some would argue yes, like Galileo, the trial of Galileo, if you look at the story of like Martin Luther, a lot of them would argue that it's because of the hypocrisy of the church and the inconsistencies that were found in the church and the dogmatic nature in which they asked you to believe led to that backlash from the scientific community against theism in general and Christianity in particular. But I would say that that's more specific to Christianity than it is to Islam. I would argue that in the Islamic worldview, so long as a person truly understands the Islamic worldview and they're not speaking out of ignorance, that because we have a very sophisticated, defined epistemology, we wouldn't be susceptible to those same backlashes that occurred within Christianity.
From the Islamic paradigm, would we deny macroevolution regardless of evidence? If not, what evidence or observations would convincingly support macroevolution?
Yeah, no, I mentioned before that macroevolution, if somebody wants to believe in it, it's not a theological problem. It would only be a theological problem when it comes to the human species, meaning Bani Adam in particular, and the children of Adam. But if somebody wants to believe in macroevolution, that this primate came from this other species or transformed from this species into that species with all other animals on the face of the earth, technically it's not a theological problem. They have every right to use it, if they're so long as they're convinced by the science.
Just food for thought, there's a brother in my community who's a Hassan. He's a Turkish brother, scientist. So maybe he can share his work. He's like really interested in speaking to someone about. His like theory, I don't know how you go about proving, is that the reason DNA is found, like DNA evidence is found, so we know that hadiths were built on to like Earth, from the Earth to create Adam. He said that the Earth would have contained like DNA samples from other animals that died, and hence the way. So that's an interesting way to look at it. Whatever. Are axioms exclusive to linguistic definitions? Being alive in and of itself presupposes parents. It doesn't need to be said that the child has parents when it's known.
Can you repeat one more time?
Yeah. Are axioms exclusive to linguistic definitions? Being alive in and of itself presupposes parents. It doesn't need to be said that the child has parents when it's known.
Yeah, I would agree, but I wouldn't say that, again, this goes back to when we were discussing about how do we understand that ayah Allah that could be shay'in qareeb? What is meant by shay? What is rationally possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Is it rationally possible for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to create something that has life, but without parents? Like a human without parents? does that result in a logical impossibility? Like how we said would be a violation of the law of non-contradiction. No, it does not. So long as it cannot be shown that it would result in something rationally possible, then purely on rational grounds, we would say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of doing that, if he so wishes.
Basically, being alive doesn't presuppose.
Right, yeah.
Like, we're saying it's rationally possible to create a human without parents.
Exactly.
But why do we get excited when science proves what is and is not, when it should be the other way around?
I think a lot of that has to do with just the world that we live in today. There was, like you mentioned at the outset, that a lot of people, just by virtue of being schooled in the Western world or in the non-Muslim world, we're told over and over again that such and such is a scientific fact, or that scientists have said X, Y, Z, and scientists are these extremely intelligent people who are very well learned, and so we must accept everything they say. And so, obviously, naturally, that's going to have an effect on the psyche. And so, whenever science does seem to, whenever the Quran or Sunnah seem to confirm a scientific fact, then immediately there's this sense of joy, like, oh yeah, our deen has been vindicated, or our deen is now definitely true. And whereas I think, like I said, if you understood Islamic epistemology and the theories of knowledge, then you would just see that as an affirmation of the ayah, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. That you would just affirm that, yeah, of course, the Quran is not going to conflict with science because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already informed us that that this Quran is not going to have inconsistencies with other realities.
How do we respond to professors who extend the theory of natural selection operating on variation within populations to macroevolution?
Like I said, if somebody wants to believe in macroevolution, that's fine. But they cannot believe in it when it comes to the human species. Same goes with natural selection. If somebody wants to believe in natural selection, that's fine. So long as they acknowledge that at the end of the day, natural selection is not happening independent from the will of God. It's happening because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has willed this as a mechanism for change within a species.
And then there's a bunch of specific examples of miracles, but I think the answer to all of them, as long as I've said, was that as long as it's rationally possible, it's not a logical fallacy for that to happen, then it fits within the paradigm.
Yeah. And so long as the evidence for that miracle is, from a transmission standpoint, is decisive.
Man, I think we'll conclude with that, inshallah. Anything else to add on?
No, I would just like to, give my appreciation and gratitude to you guys for enduring this hour and 10-minute long, what many would probably describe as a very boring lecture, but inshallah it was a benefit, and I would just urge people to learn more about their deen, and these du'as that I recited, to make that as part of your daily habit, so that in these times of fitna, we have protection from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Sek, one last question.
One last question.
Sek, my question related to microevolution is not possible because of random mutations, which is called random beneficial mutation. Possibility is like how many stars in the sky. That's the power. Is not possible.
So what was the last part you said about the stars and stuff?
The random mutations. Beneficial random mutation possibility is like how much stars in the sky raised to the power 2 is not possible. So that means it's very, very, very negligible. Random beneficial mutation is not possible. That's what the scholars are thinking of that. So random mutation is not possible. Beneficial random mutation is not possible. That's the reason macro evolution is not possible.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great deal of difference of opinion even within the scientific
For example,
community.
random beneficial mutation means why my eyebrow is here.
Yeah.
This is beneficial. So the beneficial random mutation is not possible.
Yeah,
That is
so
why the
I
power
would say
of
that that is a scientific issue. It's not a theological issue. It wouldn't be a theological issue. You know, if somebody wanted to affirm that or not affirm that, it wouldn't be an opinion issue.
Yeah, it's not possible basically. To the power of stars, that was so much negligible. It's not
Okay.
possible. And my second question to you, Sheikh, you said that 17th century is when the state and the church split. So this history that atheists is just not popped up, they have a very long dark history from 5 centuries till the 16th centuries. They are persecuted the learned peoples. For example, in the Library of Alexandria, they destroyed the entire library. They killed the director of the Alexandria Library, skinned to death, and they have persecuted Galileo Galileo. So these people who are just become a militant of Western culture, so they also painting entire religion into
Yeah.
against us.
Yeah.
That's the logic behind. That's true.
Yeah, no, very good. Inshallah.
Inshallah, I think with that we'll wrap it up, inshallah. If you have any more questions, ask me or ask one later, inshallah. Also, Jazakallah khair for taking your time out. We guide you out here so late. Jazakallah khair, we really appreciate it. And inshallah, we'll see you again on Sunday with the ISNS talking about problem evil, inshallah. And we can head over to the bank of Jazakallah khair.